Perfect. Okay, now we're going to start. So we are in 22, and we've studied bit by bit each important lesson in Luke. They're not just saying in Luke 22, Jesus did this, and then go on, because so much of the time when we have a quarterly like this, we do this for 3 months, but we've been in Luke now almost going on 6 months. So we've really been able to take Luke in great length. So today's lesson is another familiar lesson, and it's so important because have you ever heard someone say, I didn't do it? I didn't do it. Maybe a kid.
Well, yeah, if you have kids, you've heard that.
Yes, yeah. And look you straight in the eye, I did not do it. And you know, some people are a lot more convincing than others. But what makes some people tell lies? Big, fat lies. We're going to talk about that.
I have a granddaughter that tells everyone every 3 months she's pregnant and then she loses it. Then she has cancer, and I'm just so worried. It's one of Leslie's oldest daughters, so this maybe help me.
Well, this is,
To,
you might be able to pass something along on this.
Yes.
But there are different types of lies. There are habitual, and then there are some that crop up almost like, I can't believe I really said that type thing. But that's what we're going to talk about. That's what we're going to talk about, because today's lesson is about Peter. It's about Peter. When it became apparent that Jesus was arrested, we know that we had a wholesale bailout of the disciples. Now, we know that Peter followed from behind after he was arrested. John followed more and went on into the inner courtyard, but that was more because John knew the Caiaphas family type thing, but that's another lesson. But we've studied Peter a lot. You know, Peter is an in-your-face kind of guy, and that's exactly what we've studied about Peter. You know, you either wonder about Peter or you're going, man, Peter's my guy, because he's unpredictable. He goes from great success to failure. He bounces back and forth. He's just in your face, either lobbing off an ear of the servant when he was protecting Jesus and would have died for Jesus at that time. And of course, that's when Jesus was saying, no, Peter. But you know what I think is amazing is that Jesus saw the future of Christianity in Peter. How? Why? But Jesus saw it. Jesus saw the future of Christianity. So we're going to start, Joellen, in 22:54 and 55.
They seized him, led him away, and brought him into the high priest's house. Meanwhile, Peter was following at a distance. They lit a fire in the middle of the courtyard and sat down together, and Peter sat among them.
So if you will recall in verse 33, Peter said, Lord, I am ready to go to prison and die for you. So now what do we have? Peter is following at a distance after Jesus is arrested. He's not wanting to be seen, naturally. He's curious about what they're going to do to Jesus, but he's following at a safe distance so nobody will see him. He mingles in with the other people. They've even brought him into that first courtyard, and he even sits down and mingles with them in the fireplace, at the fire pit. And it's staggering to me that he would do this to begin with. You kind of have to wonder, but this is where Peter is. You don't know if he thinks that by some chance he can do something. We know the authorities have already taken Jesus in to see Ananias, who was the former high priest, and Caiaphas, who was the high priest at that time. But I'm always thinking about, what was Peter thinking of? What was he thinking of as he was sitting there warming himself around the fire? It's dark, the shadows. Was he wondering, how am I going to get out of here? Or I'm going to stay here until I find out what happens to Jesus? What are his thoughts right now? And I don't even think Peter knew, because I think Peter was scared. I think that's what it was. Joellen, if you could read 56 through 60a.
When the servant saw him sitting in the light and looked closely at him, she said, "This man was with him too." But he denied it. "Woman, I don't know him." After a little while, someone else saw him and said, "You are one of them too." Then, "Man, I am not," Peter said. About an hour later, another kept insisting, "This man was certainly with him, since he's also a Galilean." But Peter said, "Man, I don't know what you're talking about."
Okay, so here we're starting to dive deep. So we have the female servant who actually had brought him into the courtyard. By the light, by the flickering light, she sees him a little bit clearer. And, you know, it's kind of like she recognizes him. And now the deception starts. Now it begins. Why didn't he just bail after this first denial? He had the opportunity to leave right now. He really did. He had the opportunity to leave, but he didn't. Attention had already been drawn to him, but he just sat there. He just kept sitting there. Verse 58 says that after a little while, probably because Peter was fidgeting, you know how it is when you're nervous and you're looking around wondering who else is looking at you, and that's exactly what had happened. He was looking like a suspect. This is a little bit more of a direct and damaging, "you're one of them" type things, like, yeah, you're one of them. Peter's courage had been totally drained by then. He didn't have any courage. By that time, he was in too deep. I think after the second time that he's been identified, he was already in too deep. Now he was gone. Now he was gone. So now his lies are going to become big, fat lies. It just kept getting deeper. He becomes more emphatic. I am not. You were with him. I know you're one of his. I am not one of his. This is when it says in Matthew that he denied this with an oath that he was not. So he goes even more with the big fat lies, with the big fat ones. You know, just as a contrast, I think it just kind of jumped out at me when I saw the I am not, was that Jesus never denied who he was. And about this same time, Caiaphas was saying, "Are you the Son of God?" And Jesus was saying, "I am." Contrasted to Peter, I am not. Jesus never denied himself, ever. I am the way, the truth. I am. I am. Jesus would never deny who he was. So we go now about an hour into this agony for Peter. And he kept insisting. And this other guy, it almost implies that this was a continuous nitpicking. This man certainly was with him. In fact, this man is a Galilean. They could tell that by his dialect. It would be like me sitting around a fire with a bunch of New Yorkers. They would know, I am not a New Yorker because of my dialect. So they could tell, and they knew Jesus was, so that they are putting now 2 and 2 together and all of this. So this was now the biggie. This was the third denial. Peter's danger level, whether he knew it or not, had also increased, since his accuser, this accuser, was a relative of the servant who Peter cut his ear off. So he was in even more danger than he thought. So now Peter cursed, he called down curses on himself and swore with another oath as he responded with this third denial. So now this is done it. This is the third denial. So this is our $1 billion question. We've got inflation here. Our $1 billion question is, how do we explain this total collapse of Peter? Peter, how would you explain it? 2 words: self-preservation. Self-preservation won over his love for God, his love for Jesus. Self-love came before love for Jesus. It's in every one of us. And it can rear its ugly head in a lot of different ways. Jesus had already told Peter he was going to do this, because Jesus knew Peter better than Peter knew Peter, right? He had said, I tell you, Peter, this was in verse 34, I tell you, Peter, before the rooster crows today, you will deny 3 times that you know me. Jesus already knew he was going to do it. Peter didn't think anyone knew him better than he knew himself. How many times had he told Jesus, no, everybody else will desert you, but I won't. This is just like us. We think, everybody in here thinks they know themselves better than anybody else. I certainly think I know myself better than anybody else, but not better than Jesus does. Because Jesus knows that we have the capability of a deceitful heart. I would think Jody has no capability of a deceitful heart. None. But Jesus knows. What does Jesus know about Jody? Jesus knows that Jody is fully human. Jesus knows that Peter was fully human. Know how much love and gushing, oozy you have in you. You are fully human. And Jesus knows that. He does. So this is where we have to use that word again, that fully human, just like we did last week. We were using this in association with Jesus, fully human, but fully God. Well, we can't attach that part to us, just the fully human. But this is why I pray that wonderful verse in Scripture, create in me a clean heart, O God. What a verse to memorize when you can feel your heart getting deceitful, envious, jealous. Sometimes you can't help it because you're fully human. Joellen, if you could read 60b through 62.
Immediately, while he was still speaking, a rooster crowed. Then the Lord turned and looked at Peter. So Peter remembered the word of the Lord, how he had said to him, "Before the rooster crows today, you will deny me 3 times." And he went outside and wept bitterly.
One of the most important words in here, immediately, while he was still speaking, denying Jesus, the rooster crowed. You know why this is important? He could make the connection. He could make the connection with Jesus' warning and the rooster crowing. It's a little bit like disciplining your children. If you do not discipline them when they can get association with why you're disciplining them, it's lost in translation for them. So if this had happened 4 days later, it could have been lost in translation, but it wasn't, because immediately, third denial, rooster crowing. Let's just say, if you watch movies like I do, and I'm certainly not minimizing this, but this would be a perfect movie scene right now. You could just almost see it, a dramatic movie soundtrack swelling with everything on Peter's face. Because as soon as he does this, Jesus looks at him. Can you imagine? The Messiah's gaze on him when he says, "I never knew him." Man, I don't know him. That gives me goosebumps to think that his self-love made him that self-preserving. He was too afraid. It was fear. Ironically, this was kind of like a miracle that Jesus was working his way through here because he was being led. But I want you to think of something that you might have never thought of before. He had already been brought to Ananias. He had already been brought to Caiaphas. He was going to be brought to Pilate in the early morning. He was being brought to Pilate at that time. And they think it was around the dawnish time. When do roosters crow? So he was walking, Jesus was walking, dawn, rooster, Peter. That was the miracle of the timing, because that's when Jesus knew it was going to happen. So we just see Peter's just total realizing what he has done. So we have here the expression that you know is on his face. He's failed. He's failed because of fear, and he went outside and wept bitterly. The end. I don't think so. Know the end. Know the end. It is like now is when it gets good. Now is when it gets good. This was my favorite part of the lesson. It's not going to last very long, but this is my favorite part of the lesson. You can take something away from this today. Did Jesus look at him with condemnation, disappointment, and judgment? If I looked at you with disappointment and condemnation, I wouldn't have to say a word, would I? If I looked at you in love, would you know? Yeah. That's how Jesus looked at him. He didn't have to say anything. That's how Jesus looked at him. Because you know what? Peter was still going to be his rock. He was still going to be his rock, but do you know what had to happen first? Peter had to have total failure in his life before Jesus could use him. This happened because he needed Peter to be totally useful to him. And it wasn't going to happen with the way Peter's attitude was. Peter was relying only on Peter. And so now we have Peter. Usefulness, useful with 2 L's, misspelled, usefulness, was forged this night because of total failure. Sometimes you feel like a total failure. Praise the Lord. Because that's when the Lord can really start doing his most magnificent work. He was broken so he could become strong. He cries with bitterness. Now this man can be used of the Lord. This is just the most fantastic lesson. The keys to usefulness is acknowledging failure. Do you know that one of the major themes in Christian books with Christian authors, some of the greatest, Charles Spurgeon, C.S. Lewis, all of these, the basic is God started using me as I was a failure. And I mean multiple failures. Multiple failures. He uses that as his basis to say, now I can start using you. Now I can start using you. They're always surprised by it. Peter was surprised by it. But remember, Peter's greatest failure made him become the Lord's greatest evangelist. That's why this lesson becomes so significant in our lives today. It's another life lesson for us. Remember last week we were saying this is a life lesson. When Jesus had gone to pray in the garden, the life lesson was keep on fire with prayer, because then you will not be led into temptation. But it was also prayer, community, and keeping in the Word. That was our life lesson from last week. This life lesson today is obvious. Failure never makes you useless to God. Never. You see people thinking, I can never be used again. Never. Look what I've done. Look what a mess I've made of it. And God is saying, we're just now getting started. We're just now getting started. I thought, you know how I always like to bring a song in. Last week I brought in What a Friend We Have in Jesus. The words that absolutely came up immediately. You'll know it. Have you failed in your plan of your storm-tossed life? Place your hand in the hand, the nail-scarred hand. Because who doesn't have a storm-tossed life story at one point in your life? I don't care how rich your upbringing was, which mine was rich, but I have a storm-tossed life story just like everybody else. But that's when God started using me. It surprises no one more than me. And that's exactly what our life lesson is today. Wonderful lesson that we learn something more each time from these so familiar verses that we've had so often, but we still learn. Let's stand and have a word of prayer.